Hi Neil, it's great to have the opportunity to talk today about a whole range of issues that are relevant to trade digitalization and the VAT gap and fraud and barriers to SME adoption and the whole change in the way we're trading internationally. But before we start that conversation, can you just introduce yourself?
Certainly. Thank you, Chris. My name is Neil Shonhard. I'm the CEO of MonetaGo. We are a market-leading global fraud prevention company focused on trade and finance. We've got deployments globally in partnership with SWIFT, working with various central banks and multilateral banks all over the world, and happy to be here and have a bit of a UK-focused conversation.
Great. And I'm Chris Southworth. I'm the Secretary General of the International Chamber of Commerce here in the UK. And also a founding member of the International Centre for Digital Trade Innovation. So let's get started, Neil. In terms of the big change, I think in the conversation you and I have been having over the last few years, is a change in government here in the UK, which has opened up all sorts of interesting opportunities. The big change is the change in narrative from just talking about digitalization almost in isolation to some degree, and now putting a real growth and productivity focus on the conversation, which I think is really helpful in terms of framing how what we're all doing will help drive economic growth and productivity at the same time. What do you think about that? What's your view on the change in government over here in the UK?
To use a word that we've spoken of before, the attrition that there was with the old leadership, the lack of proactivity, aggressiveness, the lack of respectfully thought leadership in terms of looking to digitalize trade, provide or increase economic growth, de-risk trade, importantly, in the wake of COVID and Brexit, never more as the UK needed an uptick on its economy. And there's so much that could be done that wasn't. And I do hope sincerely that the new Labour government comes in and has a far more progressive stance. So there's much that can be done. I mean, I
Yeah,
guess we can talk about it.
Yeah, it's quite interesting. I mean, the change in tone. I mean, credit to the last government. I think trade digitalization was very much part of what they did, but we were always sort of fighting with this political narrative around free trade
Indeed.
agreements.
Yeah.
I think actually that's changed, and I think it's really helpful to talk about this in the context of growth and productivity, because I think that just generally makes more sense to the average person
Mm.
out there, whether you're a business or a citizen or voter or consumer for that matter.
Indeed.
We've had two big announcements actually from the government just in the last few days. One was around the UK signing up to the WTO e-commerce agreement, which
Mm.
is a big deal for those that haven't been following that for the last few years. It's the first update in e-commerce digital trade rules since 1992. Can you believe it? And the UK is a signatory to that, with 80 other countries who effectively represent 80% of global trade, including the whole of Europe. What do you make of that? I mean, that's a big deal for what we're
It's a
talking
huge
about.
step forward. Yeah, a huge step forward. And again, sort of that progressive stance, looking to catalyze economic growth, catalyze digitalization of trade. I hope that there's a little bit of sort of a granular focus on the fraud prevention aspects of trade, both domestically and cross-border, with the UK government being a thought leader in that space historically. UK law obviously underpins a lot of trade globally, and one hopes that they can sort of come back to their point of being a beacon and bastion of best practices for the industry. From a domestic standpoint, I hope there's a focus on the fraud prevention side of things. Reports from last year that were brought to the government of old highlighted that there was a large fraud report last year that highlighted 89% of respondents in the UK, 89% of financiers saw a increase in fraud in the last financial year. 81% of respondents saw that they believe that fraud would continue to increase in the next financial year. And with various different fraud typologies being endemic, both in the UK and across Europe, other governments in the European Union have taken a proactive stance to use financial technology to detect, prevent, and deter fraud in the trade finance space. As an example, we also can talk about the value-added tax aspect as well of that, and how all of these things add up to catalyzing growth, de-risking trade, increasing liquidity, particularly with a focus on SMEs getting that money, those that need it most. And I hope there's a laser focus on that, particularly in the UK.
Yeah, let's come back to that. I think it's a really important point. I think just to sort of finish off on the slightly political piece, I think the other message that we are getting from this new government is around the Europe and
Yep.
sitting in other parts of the world. Why does anybody care? I think it's important because you've got some really big G7 to G7 trade corridors between the UK and Europe, and obviously that's been quite a complex relationship over recent years with Brexit. But I think now's the time to use this trade digitalization agenda. It's a brilliant vehicle for cooperation where we all win, we all agree, we've all signed up to the e-commerce agreement. I think that for global trade is a good sign and a good signal, alongside all the work with ASEAN and the rest of the world, which we'll come to in a minute. So let's just sort of move on a little bit to some of the technology issues, and we'll come back to the point around fraud and VAT, because I think there's some really interesting questions here, isn't there, around digital infrastructure and what can we do to tackle a host of issues, just not just making trade cheaper, faster, and simpler. But on technology is a really key question, right? So that's attached to small and medium-sized enterprise adoption of new approaches to trade. Those two issues are quite similar. What we're always hearing and sort of get a sense of is that this isn't just about making trade cheaper, faster, and simpler. It's actually about change, and it's about moving from a system we've all been using for 200 years to actually quite a different way of trading. The moment you get into that data environment, that digital economy environment, you start using the types of solutions that MonetaGo offer, it's quite a different animal. What do you see as the main barriers as to why this is not scaling faster, particularly from a small company perspective and a government perspective?
So coming back to the sort of global perspective before we narrow in on individual countries, one of the problems that a company like ours has faced is how governments often work in silo. And that's been a real hindrance both to fraud prevention, to economic growth. Some countries or governments have been very proactive in sort of utilizing financial technology, both from large companies to small. And some countries have sort of waited to see how the market unfolds. And those countries have actually suffered from that procrastination. And sort of seeing the UK now stepping up and speaking to, say, the ASEAN Secretariat, Satvinder Singh, people like that who are champions of both financial technology, but not just that, also getting sort of cross-governmental body meetups. So we've been part of central bank governor, bank C-suite, and trade minister meetings throughout ASEAN, where they bring together all of the countries, finally seeing Europe and the UK sort of stepping into that realm when they could have been leading that from old and should be. That's most encouraging, and I hope that that continues, and obviously that will have a great deal of benefit for trade digitalization, individual countries, and sort of Europe and the UK as a whole.
Yeah, it's quite interesting, isn't it, around trade digitalization? I think we've been talking to a group of UK universities around some of this as well, just to get some wider input into what's the problem. And I think actually what we're all seem to be concluding is moving from the way we trade at the moment, which is kind of known, it's very established, it's very sort of process heavy, to the way we're talking about trading, which is very fast. It's very, it's much simpler. It's much more integrated. Actually requires a different type of thinking. It's more systems thinking, more thinking about ecosystems. Everything is connected to everything else. It requires quite a mindset change. Do you agree with that from a technology provider's point of view?
Well, yes. I mean, there's a reason to procrastinate. If I was a bank or a government, the system works. It might be slow and cumbersome and somewhat expensive, and there's many a person that doesn't benefit from that, but it does work nonetheless. And changing that mindset to have people understand that there is new revenue to be gained, it has bottom line effect on people's balance sheets, isn't an easy task. That combined with standardizing data, standardizing mindset across different jurisdictions. Of course, the regulatory and legal component of that is no small undertaking as well. So it's not an easy task, and turning that oil tankers taking some time, but I do believe we're seeing some, movement now.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And I think just to finish off on the SME point, I think, number one barrier, I think, is just a lack of awareness of what's possible. Everyone's so entrenched in the way we do things today and have been doing them for, the last few decades or so. It's about saying, actually, we can do this better. And how do you always, raise awareness around that? Number one. Number two, speak the right language to the right audience, because everyone's got their own language, especially small companies. Keep things really simple. I think that's a key part of it, with some clear guidance from all of us. So let's just move on to the ASEAN point, because I think you raised a really good point there. There is an incredible affinity,
Yes.
like-minded individuals who are interestingly in different parts of the world, who have all been on journeys from different starting points. But there's a really interesting convergence at the moment, isn't there, on solutions, what's worked, what's not worked. And the fact that we are outside of these big trading blocks, the US, Europe, China, India, and those sorts of countries, we're all trade dependent. We're all keen to get solutions. It's really exciting. What do you make of that? We've got, and I should mention, the UK now being trade digitalization partner to the ASEAN.
Yes.
It's really exciting. It kind of
is.
provides that connection and that link to work together more closely. What do you see as the opportunity?
What I find very encouraging, just to start with the foundation here, is countries like Singapore as a sort of, commodity hub for the region. Indonesia, huge growth market. But ASEAN as a whole wouldn't, challenge China per se. And yet there's a great deal of cohesiveness, forward thinking, thought leadership on a governmental level, a regulatory body level, that everybody should be, because of how close knit those countries are, that it's sort of one for all, and they are all working together in terms of trade digitalization. That should and hopefully will expand into other jurisdictions. MonetaGo is engaged with multilateral banks in multiple jurisdictions about how them, with their perspective across different jurisdictions and entire continents, is really critical in sort of adopting and advocating for the use of technologies to digitalize trade, prevent fraud, promote economic growth, financial inclusion, and all of that fun stuff that we talk about a great deal. So UK now becoming trade partners, just not with, say, Thailand, but ASEAN as a region or as a bloc, is very important too. And more of these synergies and more of these relationships and partnerships should be formed and forged. And I hope that that's something, that yourself and other parties can work on too.
Yeah, it feels a bit like we're going back to core values, doesn't it? Back to basics. The role of the UK in global trade, champion of open cross-border trade, a champion of rules and standards. It's really exciting, and I think to be working with ASEAN and that sort of region is also really exciting in terms of helping us unlock.
It's also worth noting that I do believe, having had a great deal of sort of global perspective in what's worked and what has not, with various initiatives, fintechs, technologies in the trade space, is that siloed approach, or that tunnel vision, we can do it in our country better than you can do it in yours, that's not worked yet. And finally, people are coming together more cohesively to sort of drive adoption. Cross-border trade obviously is, a very important thing, and everybody should be on the same page. Data standards, legal standards, technology standards are all critical to expediting trade digitalization for prevention and other things in the space.
Yeah, we should also give a mention to the likes of the UAE, the Commonwealth as well. There's much wider alignment around some of the thinking going on here. I fully agree with that. There's a real sense of, I think, consensus building around this stuff, which is what we need, isn't it, to drive the system. Let's just move quickly on to the VAT issues. I think the average listener doesn't always connect trade digitalization, which is quite a technical activity, serious trade for that matter, to actually driving the economy and all the impacts that has. Just tell us a little bit about why is what we're doing to prevent fraud connected to VAT and tax evasion? What can we do to tackle both of those issues?
So, I mean, let's focus on the UK here. I think the black hole in the budget's 22 billion, and the unmet value-added tax, or the tax that is yet to be collected or is not collected in the UK, stands around £6 billion. Sorry, £6 billion. Therefore, just under a third of the black hole in the current budget could be collected if the value-added tax was collected effectively. We've seen dozens of other central banks deploying or progressing value-added tax registries. Technologies like MonetaGo can play a significant role in that. Not only does that create a great deal of revenue for the government, which is obviously a no-brainer, but it also is a huge proponent to also preventing fraud typologies, maybe misinvoicing, fresh air invoicing, duplicate financing, and our technology champions that, and we're working in multiple jurisdictions on that. Obviously, coming back to that phrase, it does seem like a no-brainer, and I do hope that the new government, the new leadership, looks to deploy those kind of technologies to have such a easy win in terms of bringing so much revenue to, and you can talk about the average person, $6 billion across, I don't know, 35 odd million taxpayers is about £170 out of each taxpayer's pocket per annum. So that's a great deal of money that the government could very quickly move to gather or harvest, and it doesn't cost much to implement such a technology and move people towards that sort of panacea of collecting more money, preventing more fraud. So yeah, I think it's a no-brainer, and these sort of tax registries, fraud prevention registries for trade and finance are critical foundational infrastructure for any country. We're seeing them in developed countries, but also in emerging markets moving towards this as well. So definitely something that the UK and hopefully the Labour government looks at in the not too distant future.
Yeah, it's a really good example, isn't it, of new technologies, including AI for that matter. When they're applied, you can actually address a whole bunch of issues at the same time. And why should we be giving fraudsters an easy ride? We should be making it really difficult for them to get into the system or use the system. And I think you're absolutely right. This is an absolute no-brainer that just benefits everyone: businesses, consumers, voters, the average household. We all win from this. And to your point, I completely agree. This is cheap for value that it delivers. Really, really exciting. But we can talk on for a long time. But it's been great to talk to you, Neil, today. And I hope for those listening to this conversation, it gives you little insights as to what the thinking is. There is a wider community around us who are also very aligned, some of whom we've mentioned today. But I think now's the time for action. And if it isn't now, when is it? But this sort of convergence of ideas, convergence of laws, convergence of works on data standards gives us a huge opportunity to really revolutionize the way we trade, make it much easier, get the infrastructure into place to tackle a host of issues. And I think in the UK's case and for other economies, this is our moment to be more inclusive, to drive growth, jobs, investment, and be more efficient and productive. It's just tick, tick, tick on all of those issues. I think it's a real opportunity. So thank you very much. I look forward to speaking again. Thank you.
Yes, thank you.